In the year 1253, the Mongol Empire, seeking to outflank the remnants of the Song dynasty, which still held out in southern China, invaded the kingdom of Dali. This marked the end of centuries of independence for the land that would come to be called Yunnan, meaning south of the Cloudy Mountains. But its geographic isolation was always difficult to control, and its own geographic variation split the land of Yunnan into three: the eastern hilly lowland, the western highlands leading toward Tibet, and the southern forests stretching into Burma and Vietnam, into jungle. This made Yunnan difficult to reach, even more difficult to unify, and impossible to completely bring into the Chinese realm. For the next 4 centuries, Yunnan existed between Chinese rule and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, under Chinese rule officially, but in reality, local lords ruled themselves, occasionally paying taxes to the Yuan and the Ming dynasties to keep them from cutting off their heads. It was the Yuan dynasty with its Eurasian connections and Turkish horsemen which brought Islam to Yunnan in the 13th century. There had been some before, but it was insignificant. This was not a native religion, and it was brought by groups of people called the Hui, through Bosi migrants or Iranians, Persians, and from the northwestern provinces of China. Though the term Hui is much more complicated than this, and is actually a fusion of several peoples, whose definition and religious makeup have changed and shifted over the ages. Islam was brought by Turkish traders and Mongol administrators. The ethnic Hui, which had connections in Fujian, were blended by outside perceptions with the Muslim Hui of the northwest. Later Muslim Hui spread out from Xinjiang in the west, along the Silk Road, through Shaanxi, Gansu, Qinghai. Following the Mongol conquest, more and more Hui migrated to Yunnan, establishing Muslim enclaves around mosques. The Yuan dynasty fell quicker than any Chinese dynasty in history, lasting only 97 years. The Ming came to power in 1368 and changed Yunnan in 3 main ways. First, the seaports of the east were gradually cut off, causing Islam to decline in the east. But in the west, the Ming opened trade, establishing relations and tolerated Islam. This meant more Hui were able to migrate to Yunnan. Thirdly, the Ming allowed a man named Mu Ying to have guardianship over Yunnan. This man was probably Han Chinese, not Hui, but his name Mu does suggest he may have followed Islam. Whilst there is no evidence he did follow Islam, he did have a Muslim wife, and during his holding power, from 1377 to 1392, there was a large Muslim migration from the northwest of China to Yunnan. Yeah, he probably did. Centuries passed, and the Hui lived alongside the Yi. The Yi are several groups of ethnic minorities, which speak a grouping of 50 to 100 languages, depending on how you define a language, stretching from northwest Vietnam to the borders of Tibet. Yunnan fared well, and the Hui came to dominate much of the province. I don't know how the Yi felt about that at the time, however. The end of the Ming dynasty, though, was not as swift and clear-cut as the fall of the Yuan dynasty before it had been. The Qing, a Manchu dynasty, a different ethnicity, and its war with the Ming lasted from 1618 to 1683. That's quite a long time. And at the beginning of the Qing Dynasty in 1644, the Ming Dynasty had fallen in Beijing, but a new state was built in the south, the southern Ming. Yongle, the last known living grandson of the Ming Emperor, was chased by Qing forces, who had overthrown the Ming court in Beijing, and were now expanding south. Yongle and his loyalists established the southern Ming, which swept into Yunnan and built a government in exile. But it was not to last. Yunnan held out against the king longer than anywhere else in China, falling in 1681, but it still fell. Yunnan was a tribal frontier full of Tusi, or chieftains, and so the Qing authorities promoted migration into Yunnan to bring it demographically into the empire. This included Hui from the northwest, but also Han Chinese and Zhang peoples. Slowly, the explosive mixture of ethnic and religious multiculturalism began brewing instability in Yunnan. Hi, I'm Benjamin, and that's a bit of the context for this rebellion that went on in Yunnan in the 19th century, setting up an Islamic caliphate essentially, a state for 14 years. That's a considerable amount of time. And why am I focusing on this when my channel focuses a lot on Western civilization, our Judeo-Greco-Roman civilization with Germanic legal structures and Celtic courage? Because we in the West are actually facing something quite similar today. Two groups are aligning together against our civilization's interests. On the one hand, we have social progressives who practice what I call anti-nationalism. They don't believe that borders, nation-states, faiths, or ethnic heritage matters. And so they are using both mass migration and an alliance of ethnic minorities and historically marginalized groups like client groups. And one of these client groups, Islam or Muslims, has its own political ideology. It has its own agency. It's not like these other groups, and that's the flaw in this progressive thinking. It thinks all peoples and cultures are interchangeable, but they're not. Muslims are not stupid. They have their own agency. We can't just treat them like an historically marginalized tribe in Alaska. The rebellions that broke out in Yunnan in the 19th century in China bear semblances to things that are forming now between these major groups in our own society today. They have echoes. How exactly, I will go into later in this video, but first we need to understand the chronology and events of this Panthay rebellion, and then we can go into that. The Qing Dynasty was highly hierarchical along racial lines, more so than previous dynasties. Manchus had conquered the Han Chinese people. They then used the Han to keep other peoples in control, including the Hui, various Yi peoples, the Bai, the Miao, the Jiang, as well as Mongolic and Tibetan peoples around their borders. Yunnan was rich in resources, salt mines and minerals, as well as bringing in trade from across the borders from Burma and Vietnam. Leading up to 1850, Han Chinese migrated south looking for work, and serious ethno-religious tensions were caused by this. In his book, The Panthay Rebellion, David G. Atwill gives a good chronology of events and highlights the multi-ethnic state of the province. In fact, he spends so much time on the multi-ethnic, multicultural makeup. What he does not do, however, is give a wider context across China, and he does not state that the rise of Islam in both the south and the northwest of China was beginning to threaten the Qing Dynasty and the cultural identity of the Han Chinese as a group in their own homeland, nor does he expand on the European influence weakening China. Great Britain had won the First Opium War in 1842, taking Hong Kong, leading to Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, the United States, Denmark, and others having privileges in Chinese ports. China was flooded with opium, social decay, and guns. Not good for social stability. This weakened the king so much that when unrest spread between Yunnan's ethnic groups, nothing could really be done. Both sides, Hui and Han, were responsible for attacks on the other. Many of these happened around mosques, and I need to make a point here about that. If you have ever been near a mosque as a non-Muslim who's never been around that culture before, it can be quite intimidating. I'm not saying it is for you personally, but take into mind that it can be. Imagine if you moved away from somewhere. For example, if I went back to Houston, where I'm from, and suddenly I found, when I went back, a massive fortification-like structure with a wall around it, 4 towers, and people chanting in this foreign language, Arabic, 5 times a day. And so we need to understand that in this context, that some of the basic ideas of Islam feel like physical aggression. Both sides were making provocations. From 1796 to 1856, there were no fewer than 70 fights, skirmishes, uprisings, and other kerfuffles across Yunnan, mostly between Han Chinese and Muslim Hui, but certainly not confined to these two groups. It is just that these two were competing for control, and Yi were often caught between them, unsure of which side to join. In 1800, Hui attacked Han shops in Shuning. Not far away, at a mineral mine called Jiyi, there were fights between Han and Hui and Yi. In the year 1818, there was a full-scale uprising in Linan, in which rebels carved out a territory of control and hunted Hui before being suppressed by the authorities. In 1821, at the Baiyang mine, Han and Hui fought each other in street battles for over a week before authorities calmed it down. In 1839, when a Muslim demanded repayments of a debt at Mianing, disputes arose over a pavilion being raised across the street from a mosque. In the court case which followed, the Muslims won, which angered others in the city. It led to a massacre of the Muslims across Mianing. By the 1840s, Han and Hui were exchanging insults in public. Muslim and non-Muslims yelling at each other in the street was commonplace. A group of Muslims stripped naked and nearly lynched a Manchu official named Shu Xing-a. After this, he had a personal hatred of all Muslims. But it is important to note that there are different types of Islam in China and different schools. In the northwest, a more militant variety of Islam took root, which is different to the more peaceful variety found at the time in Yunnan. However, if you are not Muslim, how are you going to know this? Your first instinct will be self-defense. In the 1840s, Han defense brotherhoods formed called Baba. They attacked Hui Muslims, and the Hui attacked them in return, whilst appealing to the Yi minority groups, who were largely neutral but had an axe to grind against the economically dominant Han in their own land. On top of this, from the 1840s, large numbers of Muslims from the northwest, who were following more stringent versions of Islam, began migrating to Yunnan. This coincided with an increase in Han Chinese migrants as well. In 1845, Hui migrants are recorded as entering villages and mocking Han Chinese. At a local festival, the Muslims jeered the procession celebrating the 5 great mountain gods and laughed at Han and Yi celebrating their non-Muslim religions. The bad feeling was shared by both groups and led to the Baoshan massacre in October 1845, causing the death of 8,000 Hui Muslims. A bit of an overreaction. I don't think killing 8,000 people in reaction for that is the right way. To make matters worse, the Qing court in Beijing had a hard time enough keeping their Manchu identity separate from the Han, for them to distinguish between good Hui and bad Hui, as well as between different kinds of Islam, both of which were completely alien to Chinese cultural norms, was too much to ask. The violence in Yunnan continued to grow, with roaming bands on both sides, and the Han Brotherhoods killing off whole Hui villages by the early 1850s. By 1854, much of Yunnan province was in a state of anarchy. To make matters worse, the Qing Dynasty had other much bigger problems. The Taiping Rebellion began in December of 1850, which, let's be honest, was more than a rebellion. It was a Chinese civil war, and easily one of the 5 bloodiest wars in human history, at over 30 million dead. It was caused by Hong Jiquan, proclaiming himself to be the younger brother of Jesus. Yes, I didn't know this, but this guy proclaimed himself the younger brother of Jesus. It's mental. That the Taiping Civil War had a religious nature is no coincidence. The Ming Dynasty, much like our own time in the West, had lost spiritual beliefs and avoided concepts promoting deeper meanings in life. Put more simply, China was rotting morally and dying from within, and its people had no spiritual health. So when in 1856, Shu Xing'a, the fellow who had been stripped naked and humiliated by Muslims, when he began another massacre at Yunnan's provincial capital in Kunming, it started a multi-ethnic insurgency across Yunnan against the Qing Dynasty. Given how broken Yunnan's landscape is and how many ethnic groups were in play, it's no surprise at all to me that 4 major leaders arose in this revolt, with dozens of other smaller leaders in control of roaming bandit armies and tribal chieftains. In addition to this, Qing governors simply refused to enter the province, and generals made excuses to go elsewhere. The Taiping, after all, had to be defeated, and ministers were being assassinated, switching sides, or making up stories about where they were. As you can probably guess, Yunnan by 1857 was in complete chaos. Now about those 4 leaders, because this is important. Wenxiu is the first key figure. He captured Dali in the west, along a very beautiful lake, and immediately set up a Muslim sultanate with himself at the head. It's interesting this guy was born in Gansu, to the northwest, and was part of the Muslim migration into Yunnan. In fact, we in the West today need to understand this. He was most likely Han Chinese, but of a family that chose Islam. And so he was versed in Chinese classics, as well as the new Islamic school, and had traveled to Beijing after the Baoshan massacre to try and reason with the imperial court. His being from Gansu matters because of something called Sharia. A Sufi order of Islam sometimes called New Teaching, which came out of this religion. Its followers would lead several militant revolts across the empire. Remember what I said about Arabic being chanted at you 5 times a day, and how that might make you a bit angry? Well, Sharia literally means a loud system of doing. Basically, this school of Islam believes one should pray aloud publicly and make it visible you are doing so to non-Muslims. If Wenxiu was from this line of thought, it is hostile, assertive, and intentionally provocative to non-Muslims. It reminds me of a dog urinating to mark its territory. The second key figure is Ma Xinglin. We know that he followed this radical school of Islam from Gansu. Ma Xinglin was a talented military commander who helped Wenxiu consolidate his control in the west and launch attacks to the east. The third key figure is Ma Dexin, who was a Muslim who opposed Sufi Islam, and who was the most prominent Muslim scholar in Yunnan during the period. His role was more of a negotiator between Hui factions, of which there were many. He faked a surrender to the king to gain access and information within Kunming, the capital. The fourth key figure is Ma Rulong, a student of Mao Zedong who read Arabic, and who publicly opposed the Qing policy of using Hui Muslims to fight other Hui Muslims. In this sense, Ma Rulong resembles many in the West today who will only side with their nation-state so long as Muslims are not fighting Muslims. This is not uncommon. He was given a military title by Wenxiu, being called Generalissimo of the Three Directions. Quite fancy. Wenxiu in the West became the figurehead of the revolt from the beginning by building a capital at Dali and declaring his state, called Pingnan, meaning pacified southern state, a reference to subjugation under Islam. Although he allowed other religions, Confucianism, and the traditional Yi beliefs of animism. These were legalized, but let's be honest, if you are leading a revolution against Imperial China, you need allies wherever you can get them. He was being pragmatic. Wenxiu set out a policy of aligning himself with minority groups, not only in Yunnan but across China. Muslim revolts broke out in the northwest. He aligned himself with the Taiping in the east, and released mottos calling for an end to Qing rule and the liberation of the Han Chinese. Despite this and possibly telling of his true intentions, he mandated the use of Arabic language under law, a strange thing to do in China if you did not have other ideas. His official seal was both in Arabic and Mandarin Chinese. And when French explorers entered his lands from Vietnam, they found they had to translate Arabic. That is conspicuous. He also banned pork, so much for tolerance. I don't eat pork from my religious faith, and I would never ban others from eating it. For me, this is a big red flag about what this man wanted. What were his real intentions? He also killed off the entire male populations of Chinese villages that resisted. What happened to the women? For the time being, the Taiping Civil War to the east gave what came to be called the Panther Rebellion. That's Wenxiu's rebellion. It gave it a bit of breathing room. The Dali Sultanate expanded its control. Wenxiu sent forces to help Ma Rulong in the east of Yunnan, and by 1862, the capital Kunming was on the verge of falling. He even bestowed upon Ma Rulong the title Generalissimo of the Three Directions. I just wanted to say that name again. It's cool. But for reasons unknown, Ma Rulong surrendered to the king, allowing the imperial court to keep the capital of Kunming from falling to the rebels. Ma Rulong followed the Gadumu school of Islam, more moderate, more willing to accept secularization and Chinese ideas. And so there may have been some dispute over how to set up this Islamic Sultanate. We don't know. For the time, Wenxiu kept his word. The new Sultanate was multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It united three main groups: the Gansu school of Islam and the Hui Muslims who followed it, the indigenous Yi peoples, and third, various factions of dissatisfied Han Chinese who joined the rebels. In the mid-1860s, Wenxiu repelled an attack by Ma Rulong. After this, in 1867, he was able to launch an offensive of his own to take the east of Yunnan. This offensive was led by Ma Shenglin, the military commander, who won a string of victories that left the capital Kunming encircled by 1868, and the Sultanate ruling over most of Yunnan. Further east, the Taiping Rebellion had been defeated. The Qing court still faced several 100,000 Taiping troops in the mountains, but it was beginning to be able to redirect itself, despite a Muslim rebellion in the northwest of the Sharia school of Islam and smaller peasant revolts. Out of this period came Qin Yuying. Qin Yuying was a battle-hardened, charismatic leader. Without imperial permission, he retook several rebel towns with his own men. He was then sent to crush a rebellion on Yunnan's east of the Miao people, who he massacred. It was this man who Wenxiu's armies now faced outside Kunming at the end of 1868. After a year-long siege of the capital, which was beginning to fall to the rebels, Qin Ying pushed Wenxiu back and broke the siege of Kunming. It was a fateful moment for the Panther Rebellion. Although many towns were fought over and switched hands 3 or 4 times over the coming couple of years around Kunming and the hills to the west, Wenxiu would never again have momentum in his favor. The next 4 years are a tale of the Qing finally throwing their whole weight at crushing the Yunnan Rebellion after years of inaction and incompetence. Of the 4 men mentioned earlier, Ma Xinglin was killed in battle in 1871. As for Wenxiu, the final battle came to Dali in 1873. He took a fatal dose of opium and surrendered himself, hoping to spare his men. Whether he was still alive when his head was cut off is up for debate. His head was put in honey and sent to the King Emperor as proof the rebellion was crushed. 3 days later, 10,000 Hui, including their families, were massacred across Dali. A few scattered bands carried on the fight along the borders, but the rebellion was over. Ma Wulong, the traitor, went on to become governor of Yunnan. Not bad for a nice new coat. Ma Dexin was suspected by Qin Ying of stirring up trouble amongst the Hui, and so he had him executed in 1874. Hui across the province of Yunnan were massacred or driven out, but those who had not revolted were largely left alone. Though, what I am trying to show you by telling you all this is not so much about what happened afterwards, or even the rebellion itself. It's not even about China. It's about us in the West. As you can see in this video, the multicultural combination was very delicate, and tilting it off balance into mass mayhem and death was not difficult to do, and violence spiraled out of control. We in the West, every single Western country that I can think of, now has this triangle structure of political influences, just as you saw in Yunnan in the 19th century. We have the traditional loyalists, the nativists, in the majority group that's feeling like it's losing its majority, which is dangerous. We have the progressive groups or minority groups, and we also have this third group coming in, building mass, who are Muslim. And what's happening in the West is this Muslim group is aligning with this progressive leftist group in every single Western country. Germany, France, here in Wales, certainly in England. I may make a video on the powder keg that is budding in that place. America, Canada. This is not sustainable. Yes, there are different kinds of Islam in the West, which makes it even more fractured and uncontrollable. Jihad, or that school of forcefully converting the West, is a majority view in many, if not most, Muslim communities. We have the progressive left, which many are pro-globalist, erasing borders, erasing distinctions between peoples. But all this does is allows this third group to amass more people in each Western state. The big divide that we're having is on the right, actually. The majority group is splitting into anti-nationalist liberal, pro-globalization, and pro-nation state. And that if the majority group feels its identity is threatened by this emerging alliance, basically Islamo-Marxism, an alliance between Islam and social progressivism, you're going to see some quite bad stuff. I don't want to go into that. However, this third emerging political group, it's not ideologically aligned with the left. It's in opposition to the left. And the progressive left does not seem to understand that the ideological basis of Islam is as hostile, more so, to their interests in progressive cultural liberalism than the traditional pro-Western groups. And actually, those of us who value Western civilization, we are tolerant of economically socialist-leaning groups. This is democracy. You are welcome. But if this third group starts setting up like a sultanate in Hamburg, where crowds of these migrant Muslims said that they wanted to impose Sharia law on the population, they're not going to tolerate your culturally progressive views. And you're going to get situations like we saw in Yunnan. And so I hope this video is a warning of what could come if we don't wake up to the fact that the old ways of just being right and left, that's over.